I wanted to start our conversation about Malaysia's economic situation, Apurva, with this question of productivity. You mentioned the question of wages has to increase before subsidy rationalization happens. I think all of us have attendant concerns around that. Maybe begin with productivity because one of my favorite reports over the last few years that World Bank produced was around productivity, and I think other people also kind of wrote around that report a few years ago. And if I remember correctly, the World Bank said Malaysia's productivity growth is okay, but lagging behind some comparables. What do you think is needed in the next few years within this term of government, this administration, that will appreciably increase this productivity rate
Right.
growth?
So you're spot on, Charles. So productivity growth in Malaysia is not stellar, and it has nothing to do with this government or previous government. It's just a trend, long-term trend that we see in Malaysia of declining productivity growth. Now, it depends on what sort of lens you put through it. If you take a long-term perspective, one of the reasons why productivity has been declining is investments. So if you look at where, say, investments as a share of GDP were pre-Asian financial crisis, they were 42-43% of GDP. That's pretty high. And what's happened over the decades is that the share of investment to GDP has steadily and persistently come down. Now it's below 20%. It's about 19 odd percent. Right? So if you don't have investments, and especially the right quality investments, how are you going to increase your productivity?
This was both private and public investment, right?
Yes, so total investment. Yeah, so that's one. The other is on the supply side, if you will. If you look at the education system, you have to ask yourself, is the education system delivering in terms of what's required to be a productive citizen in a globalized 21st century? And you can look at the standardized PISA scores, and again, Malaysia lags in several ways. In fact, going back to what Kian-Ming, you said, one of the comparative advantages that we are able to do this benchmarking. Just last month, we launched a regional study on education, and on schooling rather, and where we found that the learning poverty in Malaysia is 40%.
What is the learning poverty?
Yeah, so this means that 4 out of 10 Malaysian kids under 10 years old cannot read a sentence, or they cannot fully interpret what the sentence says. That is much higher than most other countries in the region, right? So you have to ask yourself, so going back to the productivity issue, so if you don't get your schooling right, especially at a early, from the primary, and I would argue even preschooling stage, you're not going to get much. And talking of preschooling, let me give you another example. So it really surprised me when I first came to Malaysia 2 years back, and I had to make sure that I had my facts right. If you look at nutrition in this country, in an almost high-income country, so we found that about 22% of children under 5 years old suffer from stunting. 14% of children are obese. Right? Not obese, they're underweight. It's the opposite, they're underweight, right? And most of this is felt by, surprise, the poor, vulnerable communities. So think of your rural, poor Sarawakian kid, right? So one way of addressing this is to do through the schooling program. And if you talk of preschooling, now Malaysia has a pretty good, I think it's called Susu Sekolah, the milk feeding program. And so it's a simple thing of taking it from primary schools and extending it, advancing it to pre-school levels. Now that's an easy fix, that's an easy policy fix, and people shouldn't argue against it. So doing things like that can make a huge difference, because some of the biggest inequalities we see happen at birth. So just to wrap up on the productivity front, so getting your schooling right at the very early stage, and then through the years to have the right kind of skills. And what are the skills that people are desiring here? It's digital skills, where Malaysia lags. It's soft skills. So many Malaysians have many degrees, but are the degrees worth it? How do you get the soft skills of collaboration, of communication, of working together, etc.? So these are the things that would all help boost productivity. And the third and final thing I would say in terms of boosting productivity is make your economy more competitive. The fact that Malaysia still has a system of APs, approved permits, which are basically monopolies, If you think of rice, if you think of food security, so rice still has a monopoly. So people who provide rice still have a monopoly over providing it.
In terms of imports.
In terms of imports, yeah. So and give you throw out another factoid. So exposed to GDP some 15, 20 years ago, 2000 I think, were about 120% of GDP. Now they've declined to less than 70%, 68%, right? So why are exposed to decline? Why aren't you more competitive? Because you're not liberalizing in some ways enough, right? So you're not making your economy competitive in segments where it can be. So these three things put together, so declining investments and upping them, addressing this issue of schooling right from preschool through the life cycle to building digital skills and soft skills and so on and so forth. And then third, which is on making your economy more competitive. So I think these are it's not magic, it's not a magic pill, it's not anything new for people like us to analyze the economy, but these are the three principal things that would help improve productivity growth.
When I was working at the Ministry of Health, I chaired the committee on double malnutrition. So you mentioned one half of it, which is stunting. And actually, it was either UNICEF or World Bank study, could have been UNICEF, which showed stunting to be prevalent not just in the rural communities, which you mentioned, but also in the urban areas. And there was a study on low-cost flats. Nutrition security is certainly deficient in some families. I said the double burden of malnutrition because amongst some children, it's the other side of the spectrum, which is obesity. So one of the things that I suggested, which Treasury didn't take up, was to extend that assistance that you mentioned. You said preschool. I said, no, bring it all the way up to the first 1,000 days. That's when the mother gets pregnant, right up to the first couple of years of the baby's life. So it was a simple universal scheme where I proposed to the Ministry of Finance that we give mothers cash transfer assistance for the first 1,000 days. It's been done in many other countries. And the thinking, of course, is that at that point of a woman's life, they would be very, very predisposed to spend it correctly on the nutrition and the early development of the child. But these are the sort of thinkings, these are the sort of ideas and thinking that we can discuss later when we talk about social protection. Coming to your point about investments, the new industrial master plan, which Kian worked on, has this phrase to try to bring in more investments which increase Malaysia's economic complexity, which suggests that we want investments which don't treat Malaysia as the global factory, as a factory of the world, but rather more the R&D hub of the world, or at least where we create more value. So it's not just testing and assembly for chips, computer chips, but rather it's the integrated circuit design, it's the wafer fabrication part of it, if you just look at that particular product. Is that the right approach? I mean, do we just throw around words like economic complexity and hope that it's going to come in and that productivity goes up with the supply side measures that you mentioned just now?
Yeah, so obviously just throwing around words doesn't change things. You have to follow words with concrete actions and policies and regulations, etc. Now, in the spirit of transparency, the World Bank has also been somewhat involved with the NIMP, and we've worked with people like Dr. Kian Ming and others on providing advice. But your question, is the approach right? I think the approach is absolutely correct. Malaysia cannot be the factory of the world forever, even when it comes to semiconductors. And I'm going to share some thoughts on semiconductors. So you need to make products that are more complex. And if you look at the history of development, keeping in mind that development is a game of snake and ladder, so there's no absolute truth to it. Countries that make more complex products and complex services are the ones that develop more. Now, the causation also runs the other way. So countries that develop more make more complex products and services. So it's a bit of both, but I think the approach is definitely the right one. Now, on the NIMP, I think it's a good good plan, good document. Just the fact that it's compared to the previous industrial master plan, it's less sector focused per se, and it's more focused on horizontal interventions versus vertical ones. So all that is good. My one, if you will, critiques of the NIMP is that it doesn't talk enough about liberalization of services. So even though ostensibly it's a national industrial master plan, services are an input to manufacturing. And in the case of Malaysia, and what do I mean by services? The services like legal services, accounting services, et cetera, et cetera. And even schooling is a service, by the way, right? So these services are quite trade restrictive in the case of Malaysia. In fact, the OECD World Bank has this thing called the Service Trade Restrictiveness Index, and Malaysia is the 8th most restrictive country out of 50 that we study, Japan being the least in the region, right? So services are not liberalized enough. So that is my one sort of small critique, and I would love to hear Kian Ming's take on that, if it will. But before I do that, so Khairi, if you don't mind, going back to what you said when you were minister, you had proposed this scheme, and it goes back to what Charles said about political economy as well. To me, it seemed like a no-brainer, but it did not happen. So I'm curious, from your experience, why did that not happen?
The standard answer that we always get from Treasury, of course, is fiscal constraints. Money. So it's really about how you prioritize your spending. I feel that the House view of Treasury sometimes make it very difficult for us to argue for universal assistance, which I think has been proven in many countries. And that leads to Treasury always insisting, if they relent, on means-tested approaches. And means-tested approaches are fine, but it does create errors of inclusion, errors of exclusion, which we, I think, have learned a lot from. And if you study the effectiveness of BRIM, yes, it's been popular, but whether it's reached the actual target group that it was intended to, that some empirical studies have come up to show that perhaps not. So that's why my thinking of late has moved more towards a universalistic approach. But again, you come across this prevailing groupthink within Treasury that, let's just, why are we giving it to everyone? This doesn't make sense. It has to be means tested. Sorry, we don't have the fiscal space to do so. It comes back to prioritization of what we spend the money on in government. Kian Ming, your experience? You were in Treasury before you were at MITI.
Yes, I think you're right in terms of that kind of groupthink. But I think a way to adjust that would be, two fronts. I know we are not talking about the subsidy rationalization program yet, but I think if, let's say, to convince Treasury that the money is there, then some other programs such as the petrol subsidy, the retargeting of the petrol subsidy could be one way in which some allocation or additional allocation can be found for those programs. And then for those specific programs, rather than to say that it's universal to let's say all schools, for example, or all preschools, you could say only public schools, private schools are not included. And then for the mothers, there may be certain mechanisms whereby you want to say that, look, the implementation or the delivery of those that milk products would be in areas whereby it's very likely that only those who really need it will get it. It can be universal, but the uptake of it would be more naturally targeted towards the people who need it. On the advanced economic complexity part, I think it's an important component of the NIMP, one of the 4 missions. And I think we are in a sweet spot right now in terms of implementation and also funding, in the sense that you talked about design of integrated circuit chips. This is one area where we can see a lot more interest in moving that kind of activity out from, let's say, places like China or even Taiwan. And Malaysia is a beneficiary, or can be a beneficiary, if we get our investment ecosystem right, together with the right skills. Because I know, for example, the Koreans are interested to come to Malaysia, especially in the memory front, which is where they are very strong in. So it's a matter of getting the policies right to put that proper implementation in place.
So on that, I just remember that I said, I'll say something on semiconductors, and that's the semiconductor industry in Malaysia is a great example of the potential Malaysia has to move up the economic complexity ladder, right? So, and if you look at, because of the geopolitics, realpolitik, whatever you might want to call it, Malaysia's semiconductor industry right now is in a good place. It's exporting more to the US, it's exporting more to China, both, right? And semiconductors are now about 22% of all exports by value. I mean, that is huge. Malaysia's share of the global IC integrated circuit globally is about 8%. Again, that's huge for a country like Malaysia. But, and there's always a but if you look at Malaysia's share of most advanced patents and semiconductors, it's 0.07%.
Sure.
You know, so it's minuscule. If you look at the patents that are filed in the Malaysia Patent Office, 80% of them are foreign owned. If you look at R&D in Malaysia, it's just about 1% of GDP. Half of China is 1/3 of Taiwan's. Right? So I really want to emphasize what Kian Ming said. Says you have to combine that with skills upgrading or upskilling or whatever phrase you might want to use. Otherwise, you're going to miss this window of opportunity. And I also want to emphasize this window of opportunity is shrinking. And even, so somebody asked me this question, Kyrie, at some conference, you know, why can't Malaysia just continue specializing at the low end of the semiconductor value chain? After all, somebody needs to do it, and we have an advantage in that. And it was a good question, and it made me think, and the answer to that is that a country like India now has entered the low end of the semiconductor value chain big time. In India, the situation is reversed. So India always had an advantage in design and development, not in assembly and testing, but we all want to now become chip independent, so to speak. And India has entered that segment in a big way. Closer to home, you have Vietnam nipping away at that advantage. So this window is limited and it's shrinking.
Just to wrap this up, on chips still. So we all sort of agree more or less that this trajectory is right. Economic complexity, you want to move away from the lower value end of testing and assembly to design, to the wafer fabs. What is the role of government? Because if you look at TSMC, for instance, Taiwan, that was a government initiative. It still is a government initiative. And the Taiwan government put in a lot of money to set that up. Does Malaysia even have the fiscal ability to do this? And if it doesn't, can the private sector create this market? Let's be honest here.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think Malaysia is not where TSMC was, decades ago. So we already have a base of a decent. You have a decent semiconductor base in Malaysia already, mostly in Penang, right? So what is the role of government in all of this? Let me go back to my point on investments, how they've been declining. Now, the World Bank does investor surveys in practically every country we work, and we've been doing that for the last, 50, 60 odd years. And what surprises me most is that how consistent the top three reasons for why investors invest in any country, be it in semiconductors, be it in manufacturing, anything, have always remained the same. The first is policy stability, not even political stability, but policy stability, because politicians can come and go. But if your policy framework is stable, that's number one. Number two is the quality of your infrastructure. It used to be physical infrastructure, now it's increasingly digital. And Malaysia, you can argue, does reasonably okay on these two, but it's the third where it falls short, and which is what the role of government is, be it semiconductors or be it anything else. It's talent. And the way Malaysia tries to address the talent shortage is by providing tax incentives, which again drain the fiscal purse. These are not World Bank numbers, but BNM of years ago calculated that Malaysia loses about 8 to 9% of revenues because of tax incentives. And I have nothing against tax incentives, but you have to separate out the good from the bad and the ugly. So this is the role of government, to focus on skills and talent.
Want to try and make this discussion a bit spicier so it's not so dry. A segue to that is something people always say, Malaysians always say about ourselves, is that we are great in doing plans, and NIMP, Madani, all sound good on paper. What is the World Bank's view and your personal view about the NIMP targets. Let's begin there, and then maybe we can dovetail into Madani as well. For example, there's this great big leap that we want to get: median manufacturing wages from under 2,000 ringgit a month to 4,510 in 8 years. That sounds huge to me, 10% CAGR. Based on your observations and reading NIMP and being involved in it, is that even realistic?
So anything is realistic if you can devote the resources and efforts to it, right? In the spirit of making it sort of less less dry and less econ speak, let me ask you guys a question. It's a trick question, so don't think too hard. All right. There are 3 birds sitting on a branch. 2 of them decide to fly away. How many are left?
One.
1, right? The answer is 3. Because there's a difference between deciding and doing. Okay? And this is the problem I see with Malaysia. Malaysia has too many plans and policies. Malaysia doesn't, we know what needs to be done in this country. And it's really the doing part, the implementation part that really needs to be focused on. And then if I scratch under the surface and I did a tweet on this, on the fragmentation. So it's shocking to me, you're talking about social assistance type of issues earlier. There are about 16, 17 agencies that administer over around 170 social assistance programs. There are 70 agencies that provide some sort of skills training programs in Malaysia. There are 35 agencies at the central and local levels that provide some sort of SME support programs, right? So this is proliferation and fragmentation of that hinders implementation. Do
we have too many programs, too many departments?
It is definitely fragmented, but there's a silver lining, and I'm curious, Khairi, I wanted to ask you this question. So, if I think of it, you can just throw your hands up and say, "Oh well, it's pointless trying to do anything about it." But during COVID times, and this happened before I came here, I understand that there were at some point over 180 plus SOPs when COVID struck, and every single place had their own SOP. But Malaysia, I don't know if you had a hand in it, probably you did, ultimately consolidated that into one SOP and to My Sejahtera. So it can be done. So why can't that same sort of level of focus and intensity be applied to this sort of fragmentation that we see all around us?
Political will.
And then I'll come to the Madani question.
Political will in to give it its actual obstacle. So when you talk about the SOPs, yes, there were tens, 180 SOPs. The quartet that was chaired by Datuk Seri Syamuddin was one of the 4 ministers in the quartet. We reduced it to just 1. I think COVID SOP is slightly different from the proliferation of government departments. I think that's because we didn't know what we were dealing with, the concern of dealing with a virus, unprecedented, all of that. But I think the thinking, of course, is correct. How do we streamline things? Before I went to the Ministry of Health, I was at the Ministry of Science, Technology and Innovation. And apart from being the custodian of the nation's R&D, it was also, to me, a storeroom for agencies where you couldn't place them anywhere else. So, for instance, all the tech agencies were under MOSTI, Cradle, MDV, MAVCAP, TPM, less of a tech agency, more of a facilities management, Technology Park Malaysia, Magic, which I consolidated into Meranti, Kumpulan Modal Perdana, Might. So we had too many. And when I looked at the history of these agencies, they were created for many, many different reasons, some political and some with very, very specific mandates which end up having mission creep. They ended up, taking up more things. And at the end of the day, Treasury has to give money to most of these agencies. I think only 1 or 2 maybe were self-sustaining. The rest had to ask money for DE. Some had to ask money for OE to pay staff. And had I had another year or 2 there, I would have consolidated even more. I merged TPM with Magic, for instance, to become Meranti. That was the start of trying to streamline things. So I think we have the fragmentation that you speak of earlier has unfortunately been a product of politics. It's been a product of inertia as well. Once, I think when you were at the Treasury, Kan Meng, you spoke of zero-based budgeting. Every single department had to justify every year why they needed to exist. It was an existential question. But let's be honest,
Yeah,
it
it
never
wasn't
happened.
that.
So now it's just filling up the line item again. What did you get last year? 10 million. Okay, this year you get 15 million because we're doing well. Oh, this year we get 5 million because we're consolidating or fiscal consolidation. It's back to that.
Yeah.
So
Or you put MAFCAP and Penjana under Khazanah and then no money already.
or you do that, but that's gonna put pressure on Khazanah. Khazanah is gonna come back and say, dividends this year may be an issue because we've had to give DE for stuff that you've lumped onto us.
Yeah, to answer the political economy question a little bit further, no minister, or very few ministers will be like Harry, whereby they want to reduce the number of agencies because it will also reduce the number of jobs that you can give out and
Eventually,
budget
yeah.
and things like that. In a situation where my party DAP is and in any part of the government, any consolidation could be used to attack the government to say that you were reducing the number of civil service jobs. In the case sometimes even contract jobs. So it's sensitive, but there are cases where government agencies have been closed down or have been sort of like cold storage and not been given budget. Agency Inovasi Malaysia, that was closed down under Pakatan Harapan subsequently. And then Pemandu, this was something that was closed down and then re-emerged in another private capacity, but it was closed down and then the budget was taken away.
SPAD.
SPAD, yes.
SPAD,
Put under the Ministry of Transport.
So one thing that we've discovered in our work is that because of this excessive fragmentation, people don't know where to go to seek assistance, and it perpetuates
100%.
inequalities in
100%.
ways that you might not imagine.
Yeah.
So if you think of the SME support program,
Sure.
guess who's benefiting most from it? It's not really the SMEs; it's more of the larger SMEs or the larger firms, right? So it perpetuates inequality, and just the sheer. If I think of the rakyat, if average citizen going down to get a form or something, the sheer sort of despair and humility you have to go through to jump through all these hoops to get
So
something.
in the tech funding
much.
ecosystem, when I was at Mosti, there was this pejorative term called grantpreneurs.
Yeah.
So you have professional entrepreneurs who chase after the grants, who
There you
discovered
go.
that
There
they'd
you
be
go.
the multiple recipients because they knew which door to knock on. We got to take a break quickly because we're gonna just reset and we're gonna come back because Apurva hasn't answered whether he's impressed with the Madani narrative.
Okay.